Good evening, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of Alex Nargis, our director and CEO, I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program. My name is Caprice Bragg, and I'm a deputy director here at the museum. The annual Paul Mellon Lecture Series was established in memory of Paul Mellon, the museum's longest-serving trustee and among its most generous benefactors. The Paul Mellon Lecture is presented annually by a distinguished scholar to foster the study and appreciation of the arts, and is supported by the Paul Mellon Endowment. The museum presented the first Paul Mellon Lecture 20 years ago in 2002. I want to, before going further and introducing Sylvain Cordier, I would like to just acknowledge Jeffrey Allison, who is our Director of Statewide Programs and the Paul Mellon Collection Educator. Jeffrey? All right. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sylvain Cordier. He is the Paul Mellon Curator and Head of the Department of European Art. Sylvain, thank you.
Thank you, Caprice. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you a great friend tonight, Dr. Adrianano Amymonino. Adriano is visiting us from London, where he's the director of the art history programs in the department at the University of Buckingham. A specialist of 18th century culture and the reception of the classical tradition, Adriano has curated several exhibitions, including the beautiful Drawn to the Antique, Artists and the Classical Ideal, which was held at the Sir John Soane's Museum in London back in 2015. He's co-editor of the series Paper Worlds, published by MIT Press, which is this wonderful project of producing facsimile of unpublished works on paper produced in the 18th century. He's also an associate editor of the Journal of the History of Collections. And in addition, busy man, he's currently working on a revised edition of Francis Askell and Nicholas Penny's Taste for the Antique, and on a critical edition of Robert Adams' Grand Tour Correspondence, which will be hosted on the John Soane's Museum's website in 2023. Adriano tonight will present a lecture based on his most recent book, this masterpiece, which I promise we will have for sale in the bookshop very soon. Called Enlightened Eclecticism, the grand design of the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, which was published by Yale University Press and the Paul Mellon Center in June 2021. So I don't think there could have been a better speaker for us for this 20th anniversary of our Paul Mellon Lecture program. So please join me in welcoming him here tonight. We're very proud and very happy to have you, Adriano.
Thank you, Caprice, and thank you, Sylvain. It's a great honor to be here and to be given basically the Paul Mellon Lecture at the Virginia Museum of Art. And as Sylvain said, I had a very long relationship with the Paul Mellon Center in London, before as a PhD student, and then throughout my career has been one of the great centers for the studies in British art for all of us who work on the 18th century and on the relationship between the Mediterranean world and England and Britain in general. So what I will be presenting tonight is a book on which I worked for far too long, actually, so I'm very glad that finally is out, as in the past, and it's a book really about patronage and collecting, intended as agents that can play a vital role in shaping new directions in the visual arts, in architecture, and in taste in general. And it focuses on 18th century Britain, and specifically between 1740s and 1780s, more or less, so 50 years, in which a new type of patronage really began to become absolutely prominent. So a patronage that actually was not depending anymore on the court or the church, so the traditional providers of support for artists and architects in the societies of the Ancien Regime, but a patronage that instead depended on the taste and the decision of single families or single individuals. Individuals who actually believed that the support of art was a quintessential part of that culture of the British Enlightenment, which believed that society had to be improved in all its different sectors, and especially the visual arts as well. So in a way, this type of new patronage reflects the culture and the society of enlightened Britain as a whole, and in this sense is a more modern, a more open, a more dynamic type of patronage, especially compared to what was going on in Europe at the same time, which was very much still relying on more traditional forms of patronage. And hence, because it's based on individual decisions and individual investments, is very eclectic in the sense that at this time, in the central decades of the 18th century, styles as diverse as Palladianism, neoclassicism, Gothic revival, Rococo could coexist exactly at the same time, and even within the same campaign of patronage, within the same individual even. So it is an eclectic taste that takes shapes in England for the first time, supported by enlightened values, and hence this very cryptic title of my book, so Enlightened Eclecticism. And I specifically focus on the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, because they were the greatest patron, among the greatest patron of the period, and because their campaign of patronage, which lasted for 50 years and was enormous in terms of scale and very varied in terms of choices, represents an ideal lens, an ideal case study, through which one can analyze, in a way, the general directions and developments of British art and European art in the long 18th century. So, as in an 18th century play, I will introduce first the character, the main characters of the plot, and then I will set the stage on which their stories unfolded, and then at the end I will draw some general conclusions, some conclusions of a more general character on the importance of the patronage of the Northumberlands in terms of development of British and European art as a whole. So here they are. When they got married, and this is a typical marriage portrait that was painted in 1740 when they got married, Elizabeth Seymour's Percy was the heiress and the descendant of one of the most important aristocratic families of England, the Dukes of Northumberland, the Percys, a family that actually arrived in England with the conquest of the Normans in 1066 with William the Conqueror. While Hugh Smithson Percy, her husband, was a baronet of much humbler origins from Yorkshire. His grandfather was an haberdasher, so was really a match made in heaven, in the sense that actually they really married for love and not for interest. Because, and there is a reason why, because at this time in 1740, Elizabeth Percy was not destined to inherit the title, the fortunes, and the estate of the family, because her brother was still alive. But a few years later, in 1745, her brother died on his grand tour. And all of a sudden, this couple that until then had been, in a way, destined for a provincial life in Yorkshire, in the middle rank of the British aristocracy, started an ascent on the social ladder which could have been written by Henry Fielding. So in 1750, they inherited all the estates and the titles of the Northumberland and all the houses of the Northumberland. In 1752, he took his seat in the House of Lords. She became Lady of the Bedchamber of Queen Caroline and Queen Charlotte later on. He became Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and I will not bore you with all this long list of appointments, but eventually all this political progression and social progression culminated in 1766 when the couple was nominated as first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, and the dukedom, as you know, is the highest, in a way, title in the British aristocracy. And I think that there's no better visual document to understand the ambition, the limited ambitions of this young couple compared to the ambitions of the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland 25 years later, than to compare this early marriage portrait with this portrait of the first Duke and Duchess painted by Joshua Reynolds, although this has been completely repainted in the 19th century, unfortunately, where they display, of course, all the symbols and all the regalia of their new status. So, as you can imagine, one of the most important elements of this social progression was to stress, of course, the heritage of the Duchess and minimize, in a way, of course, the ancestry of the Duke. And this, in a way, conditioned very much their love for pomp, for show, and for heritage and heraldry. This incredible social ascent, when she died in 1776, he died 10 years later in 1786. When he died in 1786, he was the richest man in England, because he had administered basically the estates of the Northumberland in the north in a very clever way, and most of their income came from rent and farming. He basically imported millions and millions of trees in order to reforestate Northumberland and the county of Middlesex, etc., etc. So a typical, of course, a privileged aristocrat of the age, but also driven by that typical aspect of the culture of the British Enlightenment, which we call improvement. So the improvement of the infrastructure of society, the improvement of the living condition of society, and of culture of the period, which was absolutely compulsory for anyone in his and her position, because we will see that she played a vital role in the decision of the couple. This social progression and this political and economic expansion was accompanied throughout their career by patronage of artists, of architects, and especially by a huge campaign of rebuilding the infrastructures of London. London in the middle of the 18th century is a city in great expansion, is a mercantile city, is the most vibrant city of Europe in terms of movement of goods and in terms of expansion. What they did was to build several bridges, several hospitals, patronizing several societies. They were behind the foundation of the Royal Academy for Artists in 1768, etc., etc. And I will just show you one wonderful example from this public campaign of improvement that the couple, in which the couple was involved, and is the construction of Westminster Bridge, and of which the Duke was the president of the committee behind the erection of Westminster Bridge, and at the same time he commissioned Canaletto, the most famous landscape painter in the 18th century, and a painter who lived several years in London. He commissioned to him this wonderful view of Westminster Bridge under construction, through which you can see basically the Thames, St. Paul, and most of the houses on the Strand. At the same time, this painting was printed. The print was disseminated to the four corners of England, of course, advertising that the Duke was not only a person who actually had been instrumental in the erection of Westminster Bridge, but also that he was one of the most important patrons of Canaletto in England. So a very clever way of promoting himself from a social point of view and from an artistic point of view. Tonight I will focus on the private spheres of the Northumberland rather than the public activities of the Northumberland. What they did is, when they inherited all the houses and estates of the Northumberland in 1750, they started an orchestrated campaign of patronage, which involved all the houses of the family, and I will mention them in a second, but you see that all the houses are distributed more or less over the whole territory of England, from north to south. And these houses were the Urban Palace, so Northumberland House on the Strand, where Trafalgar Square is today, Stanley Hall, the country house in Yorkshire, Sion House, a suburban villa close to Richmond and close to Twickenham today, still standing, and Anne Castle, the baronial castle in the north. And all this campaign, urban palace, country house, suburban villa, baronial castle, was completed by the erection of a huge funerary monument at Westminster Abbey when the Duchess died. Westminster Abbey, being the shrine of the nation, of course, was the most important place to be buried in the 18th century. Unfortunately, most of the houses of the Northumberland have been destroyed throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. So Northumberland House is not there anymore. It's more or less in front of the National Gallery today and was knocked down in 1874 in order to connect Trafalgar Square with the newly built embankment of the River Thames. Stanley Cold was destroyed in 1923. Anne Castle was completely rebuilt in the 19th century. The only house that they refurbished still standing is Sion House. So my research is based mostly on surviving visual and written evidence, and was really a long research that took me to Anne Castle, where the archives of the family are still preserved. And I tried to reconstruct basically this jigsaw puzzle of evidence, trying to approach everything they did from an holistic point of view. So bringing together the study of the estates, of their political careers, of architecture, of interior decoration, of objects, etc., and try to understand how all these different aspects of their patronage dialogue together. So try to understand why they decided to use certain styles for certain houses, and why they decided to distribute the collections according to the different styles that they chose in order to renovate the houses. Here you can see other paintings by Canaletto, Northumberland House, Sion House, and Anne Castle. They were the greatest patrons of Canaletto during his period in England. So I will start with Northumberland House because this is the first house that they rebuilt between, as you can see, 1750 and 1758. The initial financial investment of the couple was focused on Northumberland House. Only by adopting this holistic approach to all the properties and all the collection, one understands that the taste of the Duke and the taste of the Duchess were completely different. That eclecticism that I mentioned before, a very gendered division in terms of taste, which was not in opposition, as we might think, but actually was complementary. There are two sides of the same coin. The Duke was a promoter of the classical ideal, of the revival of the culture of Greece and Rome. The Duchess was instead a promoter of Gothic, of the Middle Ages, of the past of Northern Europe, the past of blood and lineage, the past of England. And these two cultural allegiances are played throughout all the properties. At Northumberland House, which probably is one of the most interesting residences of London at that time, the largest palace of London at that time in terms of scale, at Northumberland House they decided to renovate the urban palace according to Palladian and Rococo style, very fashionable, very modern, very urban, because this was the showcase of the family in town. Northumberland House, this is the wonderful map of London by John Rock, printed in 1747, so immediately before they started renovating. This is where Northumberland House is. This is today Trafalgar Square. The National Gallery is there. And now there's a huge avenue here called Northumberland Avenue that crosses exactly where Northumberland House was. Huge private palace, conveniently located between St. James, so the Royal Palace, the Houses of Parliament, Westminster, and the City of London, where trade happened. So conveniently located between the two different halves of London. Northumberland House became in time one of the most fashionable houses in town, especially during the summer period and in the autumn. Foreign ambassadors, foreign royals came to visit, famous figures of the 18th century like the playboy Giacomo Casanova, famously basically resided at Northumberland House. And also, as you can see here, I was lucky because a huge amount of ephemera are still preserved at the British Museum, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and at Anne Castle. This is one of my favorite. It's an invitation card where Lady Northumberland invites the great Horace Walpole, the arbiter of taste of the period, with just built Strawberry Hill and published The Castle of Otranto, so he's the inventor of the Gothic novel and Gothic revival. She's inviting Horace Walpole at a private party at card at Northumberland House, and of course they gambled. One of the great private activities of 18th century urban elites was gambling, as you know very well. And this is a wonderful Rococo chinoiserie card, of which there are still many, testifying of this sort of like semi-public function of the interiors of Northumberland House, where political canvassing happened on a weekly basis, because she held this soirée on a French model. She was a great Francophile. Soirée every Friday. Northumberland House was immense, as I told you. If you put together the inventories of the 18th century with 18th century plans, you see that it had 370 rooms, just to give you an idea, distributed on several levels. Today I will focus only on 2 rooms on the ground floor and a few rooms on the first floor. The ground floor is where the state rooms, so the public rooms of the house, were located. And this was the realm of the Duke. So the taste of the Duke was displayed at ground floor in this series of rooms. And here his Italophile Roman taste, the so-called rule of taste of classicism, was displayed in its most elaborate way. In the dining room here, he displayed basically the famous old masters of the couple. I'm not going to analyze them in detail, but we have 2 Titians, Palma il Giovane, Dobson, Tintoretto, Carracci, etc., etc. So a huge collection of Italian and Flemish old masters, most of which history paintings on a large scale, so public paintings destined for public rooms, and testifying of the Duke's allegiance to, of course, the taste of the High Renaissance and the early Baroque, which was absolutely dominant in England at that time. This taste was even more prominently displayed in this huge gallery ballroom that he built from 1750 to 1758 and opened in London in 1758, being one of the great happenings of the central decades of the 18th century. This gallery contained 5 life-size copies of famous frescoes in Rome. Raphael and his school, so Guido Reni and the Carracci, the great academic tradition of the High Renaissance and early Baroque. Life-size copies that he had commissioned in Rome were executed in Rome by Pompeo Batoni, by Mengs, the most famous academic painters of the time, and then shipped to England through Leghorn. Was one of the most expensive commission of copies of the 18th century. Not only because he wanted to display to the public of London his allegiance to, of course, the rule of taste, to the grand tour culture, and of course to the academic ideal of Roman painting, but also because this gallery, I found, fortunately, in the diaries of many artists of the 18th century, was open to young British artists every week. Remember that the British Academy was founded only in 1768, one of the last academies to be founded in Europe. So this became a sort of de facto academy before the foundation of the Royal Academy, where young artists could come and copy the great examples of High Renaissance and early Baroque frescoes. Just to give you an idea, so there's a pedagogical intent, that culture of improvement of national taste that I mentioned before. Here we see it in action, in a way. So, just to give you an idea of the dimension of this room and of this painting, all the other paintings in this room are now today in Venice. For a strange destiny, they came back to Italy, and they are at Palazzo Labia. While the School of Athens by Raphael, here a copy by Mengs, is today at the Victorian Albert Museum, and it's been restored recently, but just to give you an idea of the size, it's today displayed in the Cass Gallery of the Victorian Albert Museum. It's the last ruin, the last relic, one of the few surviving relics of Northumberland House after its demolition in 1874. If we climb the stairs of the house, as it were, through the main staircase, we would have been introduced to the private apartments of the Duchess. This was a completely different set of interiors. This is a plan that I reconstructed based on 18th century plans and inventories, so matching rooms with their names in a way. And this series of rooms with this enfilade of little rooms here was where she displayed these enormous cabinets of marvels, which she called her private museum. And her private museum was famous throughout London. It was a cabinet of marvels, but arranged according to the new taxonomy of the Enlightenment, much more scientific, and was based on the same categories of the recently opened British Museum. The British Museum opens in 1759, and she modeled her museum, her private museum, on the first great public museum of London, of which her husband was one of the first trustees. So there's an osmosis and a dialogue between, of course, one of the greatest achievements of the Enlightenment, so the British Museum, and what she was trying to recreate in her own home. Unfortunately, most of the objects of her great cabinet, of her museums, have been sold by the family in the 20th century, especially through auction houses, but some still survive. And especially what survives at Alnwick Castle is this extraordinary product of the 18th century, of this taxonomical mindset of the 18th century, is her handwritten museum catalogue, which she clearly intended to publish if she didn't die in 1776, whereby all the different categories of her collections are catalogued. And we go from paintings to prints to medals and coins to ethnographical specimens to cameos, intaglios, and sculptures, historical curiosities, and then all the naturalia, so specimens from the natural world, so petrification, fossils, crystals, gems, corals, shells, all of which, unfortunately, is gone, as you can imagine. And then, eventually, of course, the books, because never forget that the library in any 18th century collection is the heart of the collection, because there you find all the books, all the knowledge on which the collection is based and arranged. This collection, I will show you only some categories, was a celebration mostly of Northern European culture, so the opposite of what the Duke was displaying at ground floor. The culture of Britain, the culture of the Netherlands, the United Provinces of Flanders, of the German Principates, of France. All the objects in her collection were either bought on the London market at auction houses, or during her travels. She's a formidable character. She's one of the few women who traveled alone in the 18th century. Every year from 1750 onwards, she traveled to Europe in the autumn with a long retinue of coaches, as you can imagine, but on her own, without her husband. And throughout all these trips, which we still have hundreds of diaries, she was an obsessive writer, all these trips, she collected items for her collection. She never went to Italy, which is very meaningful. In a period where the Grand Tour was focused on Italy, she went very often to Holland, to the northern parts of Europe, while her husband went to Italy 3 times on different Grand Tours. So their taste is really, you see, when they're playing different games in a way, but the two games are trying to evoke different pasts, but they are the product of that type of antiquarian culture of the mid-18th century. One of my favorite categories is historical curiosities, in this attempt of evoking the past, the British past, the past of her family, of course, through objects. Here she lists all the objects that she collected. Queen Elizabeth gloves, which are still surviving at Alnwick Castle, and many scholars think that they're the original gloves of Queen Elizabeth. Or here there is, where is it? A cap. No, wait a second, sorry. There you go. A nightcap of Oliver Cromwell. So the nightcap of Oliver Cromwell, maybe this is a bit more, you know, we can exert a certain degree of skepticism, but certainly she believed that this was the nightcap of Oliver Cromwell. This is very much similar to what Horace Walpole was doing at Strawberry Hill, so creating rooms where the past, the national past, could be evoked through the objects, and is a typical, in a way, is a typical characteristic of British culture of the middle of the 18th century. The paintings that she displayed were completely different from the painting that her husband displayed at ground floor. Cabinet paintings, very often Netherlandish or Flemish, small. No history paintings, very often landscapes, genre scenes, still lifes, portraits, etc., etc. The so-called cabinet pictures that actually were intended to be displayed in spaces which were smaller, more intimate, reserved to a more intimate audience. And some of them still survive at Sion House and Anne Castle, but she had hundreds of them, many of which she bought herself in the Netherlands, in France, and in Germany. An enormous collection, and mind you that I'm just scratching the surface here, but the largest collection of Northern European medals ever assembled in Britain. If her taste was sometime quite varied, she was very good in some fields, less good in other fields, her knowledge of Northern European medals was absolutely unmatched in the 18th century. So again, this taxonomic mindset. A fantastic collection of miniatures by a Swiss artist called Jean-Louis Fesch, which she kept in drawers in a library, framed. Unfortunately, they've been unframed in the 19th century, where actually she asked him to portray all her acquaintances and all the people she met on her travels or in London, really, the polite world of Europe in a drawer. So that her cabinet is really a microcosm that reflects, of course, the macrocosm of her life and of 18th century culture in general. You have the Duchess herself with her sons, George III, Russian ambassadors, the very famous French philosopher Voltaire, whom she met in Switzerland, but also dancers of the Opera House, the great actor, Shakespearean actor, David Garrick, etc., etc., etc. So you have the theater, you have the opera, you have the ballet, you have the polite world of the vibrant London of the middle of the 18th century, still surviving at Anne Castle. Then in the ethnographic section, an enormous amount of objects that actually were brought back to England by friends, especially captains of the Navy or military men, friends of her husband, from the Americas and from the Far East. This is a wonderful object that is one of my favorite. It's one of the earliest Chinese-English dictionary, illustrated, that was produced in Macau for the Western market. And it's really an early example of this type of objects. And also a huge natural history library. This is, of course, probably many of you recognize this wonderful sort of proto-surrealistic plate with the head of a pink flamingo. This is Catesby's Natural History of Carolina, etc., etc., one of the most famous natural history books of the 18th century. And then a huge collection of shells, of corals, of marbles, of woods, etc., etc. The whole world, literally, of man-made objects and natural objects concentrated in an intimate space, and all the objects, of course, were shown to the most knowledgeable or intimate guests. If Northumberland House is the showcase of both Duke and Duchess, of the couple in London, is their, in a way, political hub at the center of London, Sion House, the suburban villa, I called it the Roman suburban villa, was the realm of the Duke. So Sion House became a house of the Northumberland families in the 17th century. Here you see Sion House in a wonderful painting by Canaletto. Today is close to Richmond, as I said, in Twickenham, so it's in the western part of London. Here we have a wonderful view of Sion House in a print by Sir Frank Short in the Frank Razor collection here at the Virginia Museum of Art, so a wonderful late 19th century actual impression of Sion House on the river. And this was literally a suburban villa because it could be reached from London by barge or by coach every week, and they spent most of the weekends at Sion House. And this is Sion House as it is today. So if they kept the 17th century exterior of the house almost unchanged, this, you see, sort of like late Tudor castellated quadrangular house, in order to stress the historical presence of the family in the county of Middlesex. The interiors were completely transformed by the rising star of British architect Robert Adam between 1760 and 1768. Sion House is a Roman villa, is an attempt at resurrecting an ancient Roman villa. Why? And this is the most interesting part of it, always try to link, of course, artistic patronage with the social and political spheres, because the Duke was the MP for the local county of Middlesex. So he wanted to erect a space where actually he could play the role of a new Roman senator in a surrounding which, of course, was very familiar to all his friends who had been to Rome on their grand tour. He was also a member of the Society of Antiquaries, of the Society of Dilettanti, so they all shared a culture that was based, of course, on the revival of classical antiquity and on the revival of ancient Rome on the British soil. The importance of Sion House cannot be overstressed in the sense that this type of style, which Adam called the true style of antique decoration and was literally forged as Sion House together with the Duke, who controlled the execution of each single detail of the house, is the first house that Robert Adam built after he came back from Rome, where he trained for 6 years in the company of Jean-Louis Clérisseau. He built Clérisseau, he is behind the design of the Capitol here with Jefferson, as you know very well. And when he came back to England, Sion House is the first place where actually he could display this true style of antique architecture and decoration, which today we call neoclassicism. This style then later on crossed the channel to influence architecture from St. Petersburg to Lisbon to the east coast of the United States. So it's really can be considered a laboratory for the development of a new style in architecture and interior decoration. And it's still absolutely splendid in its opulence. How do you recreate Rome on the British soil? You recreate Rome on the British soil through a principle of citation of canonical models. Canonical models that anyone who had been on a grand tour would have seen in Rome, architectural models, sculptural models, and ornamental models. So this principle of citation is threefold, as it were. I'm just showing you how this worked in 2 rooms, because as you can see, Sion House can be considered in a way a collection of architectural Roman typologies. We have a triumphal arch, we have the Pantheon, we have the Roman Basilica, we have a Roman bath, etc., etc. And anyone who had knowledge of this type coming into Sion House would have recognized the different architectural citation. I will show you the vestibule and the dining room. And those of you who were with me at Sion House in April will remember also the long gallery, which was transformed into a Roman columbarium, but tonight we don't have time to talk about that. So the vestibule, as you see here, was transformed into a Roman triumphal arch. A Roman triumphal arch, and especially the Arch of Constantine, and the medium through which this transfer of culture between Rome and London could happen is through prints, not surprisingly. The 18th century is the century of paper, is the century of prints. And these prints circulated throughout Europe, allowing, in a way, the creation of a shared antiquarian culture, as I said, from St. Petersburg to Palermo in many ways. In this case, Adam used this book by de Godet, which is called Les Édifices Antiques de Rome, published in 1682, and was, for the whole of the 18th century, the standard book on Roman antiquities, where arches, basilicas, columns, you name it, was reconstructed in plan, in elevation, and in section. So very practical to be used by artists and architects throughout Europe. Second level of citation, classical, canonical, ancient sculptures that everybody would have seen in Rome. If you look through basically the opening of the Triumphal Arch, as it were, you can see the Apollo Belvedere, still today at the Vatican, and the so-called Dying Gladiator at the Capitoline Museum. I would like to remind you something that we have completely forgotten today in many ways, that between 1500 and 1900, so for 400 years, the most famous works of art in the Western world were a canon of 100 classical sculptures, most of which could be seen in Rome, in Florence, and a few in Paris and Madrid. But this is exactly why, in many ways, Rome was the center of the Grand Tour. Because in Rome, you could, in a way, round off your classical education in the living presence of the remains of classical architecture and remains of classical statuary. So even in this case, this is the wonderful bronze copy by Luigi Valadier, one of the greatest goldsmiths of the 18th century, commissioned by the Duke of Northumberland. And again, you can imagine the logistic of basically all this commission executed in Rome, shipped back to England with all the agents in Rome, etc., etc. This was based on the famous dying gladiator at the Capitoline Museum, still today at the Capitoline Museum. Even in this case, the medium through which the different statues, the different copies displayed at Sion House were chosen was a book of several antiquarian books. In this case, the famous Raccolta di Statue Antiche e Moderne, published in Rome in 1704, which became for the whole of the 18th century the standard reference book on classical, canonical, ancient statuary. Two things to remember. First, that at Sion House there were no works of art on display apart from copies of classical canonical models, so a really philological attempt at resurrecting Roman antiquity. Second, that all these books were included in the library of the Duke at Sion House. So it's a very sophisticated example of an architectural typology that contains in itself the sources of its own architectural logic, of its own composition. And these books could literally be lifted from the shelves, open, in order to illustrate the logic, both formal and iconographical, on which this principle of citation was based. Third level of citation, and from my point of view, one of the most interesting because it was very difficult to reconstruct in many ways. This whole apparatus of overmantles, of plaster roundels and medallions, of grisile decoration, etc., etc. So the formal and figurative apparatus that constitutes in a way the environment in which these statues are located. The decorative elements of the house. This is the dining room at Sion House. Also, all of these elements were actually derived from canonical sarcophagi, friezes, gems, coins, and paintings that you could see in Rome through, of course, great late 17th century and 18th century publications. You see that it's really, in a way, a world of reference that was shared throughout Europe. It's really a code. From a semantic point of view, is a cultural code. And if you entered a place like this and you were able to recognize this type of reference, of course, that meant that you were part of a certain enlightened, cosmopolitan European culture. This type of logic, so citation of canonical models through prints, happened for the first time at Sion House, and then it became absolutely widespread all over the Western world. So again, I would like to stress the importance. And very cheekily, I decided to show two chimney pieces from Monticello, which, as you know, actually was built between 20 and 30 years after Sion House. In the chimney piece, in the main hall, you have this frieze with two griffins, which comes from the frieze in the temple of Antoninus and Faustina in Rome, with a wonderful vase in the middle and the acanthus scroll, or the chimney in the dining room, where these wedgwood plaques designed by Flaxman are based on the famous sarcophagus of the Muses. You see that some are lifted literally from the sarcophagus, which was then in the Capitoline Museum, and today it's at the Louvre. So again, a system of reference that actually from Sion House and from England actually spread all over the world, even to Monticello and the Jefferson taste. Last chapter of this saga, the baronial castle in Northumberland. When this castle was built in the 12th century, Alnwick Castle, one of these great strongholds of the north against the constant Scottish raids and invasion from the north. When they inherited the castle in 1750, the castle was in ruin. As you can see here from this wonderful painting by Canaletto, was literally inhabitable. So, from 1755 to 1780, exactly at the same time when they were refurbishing Sion House as a classical villa, Robert Adam, for the Duchess in this case, redesigned Alnwick Castle as a neo-Gothic baronial castle in the north. She decided to have Gothic revival for the castle. So an evocation, not an evocation of the past of Greece and Rome, the cosmopolitan past of his husband, who was a nouveau riche, a self-made man in many ways, and who could, in a way, identify himself with the Republic of Letters of the British Enlightenment and of the European Enlightenment. Here she wanted to display the past of Britain, the past of blood and lineage, and the past of the Middle Ages, when the Northumberlands, of course, were called the kings in the north, because they really controlled the northern parts of England, very far away from, of course, the crown in London. So, as I said, Anne Castle, from my point of view, unfortunately, was completely refurbished in the middle of the 19th century. So what you see today is a Victorian, later Gothic revival, and everything that Adam and the Duchess did between 1750 and 1780s is gone forever. So it's a much more, solid mid-19th century idea of Gothic. And incidentally, it's also where the first movie of Harry Potter was filmed. So when you are there trying to concentrate in the archive, you're surrounded by kids trying to fly on brooms, but it's, as you can imagine, is one of the major sources of revenue for the castle. So it's a very lively environment. However, also in this case, I had to rely on visual and written evidence because it was all gone, putting together the jigsaws of this huge puzzle. And fortunately, we still have some very early photographs of 1845. So some among the earliest photographs ever shot in England of the exteriors of the castle as designed by, there is a medieval masonry there, which was embellished by Adam exteriorly. But you see that the castle is much lighter, is a much more, in a way, sort of Rococo idea of Gothic revival. Inside the castle, you had a sequence of room of immense size, very colorful, where, as at Sion, the collections were displayed according to the style chosen and the type of past that they tried to resurrect and recreate. So there were no works of art whatsoever, no presence of the antique at all, but instead was full of arms and armors, portraits of the ancestors, and a huge display of heraldry. Of course, coats of arms of the Northumberlands, not of the Smithson. There was thousands of coats of arms of the Northumberland, one shield of the Smithson, just to give you the idea of the priorities of the Duchess, who, of course, was so proud of her ancestry that she became, in a way, the subject of criticism in London. She was ridiculed by the press because she revived the heralds and the jesters of medieval times who actually walk in front of a chariot in the middle of London. So borderline obsession, I would say. But in these wonderful drawings by Robert Adam, who was at the same time designing the classical Rome for the Duke, so this eclecticism that I was mentioning before, they all survive today at the Sir John Soane Museum in London, which has the largest collection of drawings by Robert Adam in the world. And this is why the critical edition of the Adams letters will be based at the Soane Museum. As I said, a very fanciful recreation, a very 18th century recreation of the Gothic, as you can imagine. But also, as I said, this huge display of heraldry in the chapel, which was based on the King's Chapel at Cambridge or the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey. The most important point to stress here, and then I'm going to conclude, is that, as I said, these two different evocations of different pasts, they were not in contradictions because the Duke took control of the actual execution of the works at the castle. So if the Duchess was behind the commission and controlled and influenced the drawing part of the execution, he was, being a trained architect, like Jefferson, an amateur architect, he was in charge of the actual controlling of the work of the architects and the bricklayers and the masons on site. Second thing is that actually also in this case, the evocation of the medieval British past was based on canonical models. In this case, not classical, but Gothic and British. The ancient St. Paul Cathedral, the Cathedral at Canterbury, York Minster, etc., etc. all of which had been published in antiquarian publications which are present in the library of the castle. So a Gothic antiquarianism versus a classical antiquarianism of the Duke at Sion House. Here you see the coat of arms of the Duchess published in the late 1750s in the so-called Gentleman magazine, one of the most famous newspapers of the period. So to conclude, remember that there's also the elevation of this huge monument at Westminster Abbey, which of course attracted the press and the comment of all the polite society in London. To conclude, I would like to stress two things. First and foremost, that even in terms of graphic design, I try to evoke this eclectic juxtaposition of different tastes and different past in the design of the book. So juxtaposing classical details from Adam drawings to Gothic details, and objects of different natures from the Duke and the Duchess collection. And I would like to conclude, as I said at the beginning, with a few considerations of a more general nature. So why this eclectic taste? Why this juxtaposition of different styles and taste could happen in England at that time and not in Europe? First and foremost, because it's very complex, and I will try to summarize here. First and foremost, because of a different political and social structure of the British society. It was a constitutional monarchy, it was not an absolute monarchy, it was much more open, more dynamic, a mercantile society, open to exchange between different individuals and different cultures of the world, is the expansion of the empire at this stage. But also there are reasons of a more cultural and philosophical nature. And these I will focus on two. One is a new conception of history and the past, promoted by the culture of the Enlightenment, the antiquarian culture of the Enlightenment, which for the first time actually became aware of the fact that any cultural phenomenon is placed in history. They became aware of the historical nature of any cultural phenomenon. And they didn't recognize the classical past of Greece and Rome as the only model for behavior, for aesthetical choices, for the present and the future. The classical past of Greece and Rome becomes just one of the many pasts that can be evoked in order to support narratives in the present. And so this new attitude, this more historical attitude towards the past, which deconstruct the classical canon, in many ways open up the spectrum of historical revivals. The revival of Gothic England, the revival of, in a way, the medieval past of the northern Europe, together with the revival of the classical past. All consideration that will lead to the historicism of the 19th century and to a more modern and scientific approach to the past, which characterizes the discipline of history today. The second point is a different conception of beauty, and this is probably the most important element to stress. This is related to the empirical attitude of the British Enlightenment, which thought that beauty was not based on the classical canon and on classical proportion. So beauty is something that is not objective and universal, and is something that cannot be understood through the intellect. The approach to beauty cannot be rational. This is a revolution in the history of European aesthetics, because until then, of course, the classical ideal had stressed the fact that there is one taste, and this taste is based on proportion, on harmony, and so it's something that can be, in a way, understood through a rational approach, through beauty, whether in architecture or in sculpture or in painting. Many authors, Horace Walpole, David Hume, Burke, started to argue in the 1750s that beauty is something that instead is experienced through the senses, through the eyes, through the ears. And so, because the sensorial experience is different in any of us, beauty cannot be anything else than relative and subjective. And this changed completely the approach towards art of the Western world for good, because this type of consideration, of course, will open up a new type of aesthetics, a new type of conception of beauty, which is much more relative, which still, in a way, characterize our approach to art today. each of us has a different conception of beauty and of taste. So, to conclude with the final consideration, by studying the historical and aesthetical characteristic of the British Enlightenment through one of the most important episodes of patronage and collecting of the age, one can see, in a way, can analyze the seeds and the beginning of cultural frameworks that in many ways still condition the world in which we live today. Modernity, in many ways, really started in the middle of the 18th century in Britain, and the Northumberland were an active part of this gigantic shift in culture and politics of the time. Thank you very much.